solid swag here. Do I got to flip this thing on? That's a no. It's coming out just fine. I'm going to put that right there. Got that for my daughter. Oh, yeah, let's, I'll plug into my computer. That seems like a good start. I thought we'd talk about websites a little bit this morning, if that's cool. Like the front end part, though. Get a little juice. Can you? I got you. How to think like a front-end developer. That's the title of the talk, but it's kind of like I'm going to end up talking about how front-end development hasn't fundamentally changed what it is, but the responsibility bucket got a lot bigger. It's getting weird around here. This front-end design stuff, front-end developer stuff. So that's kind of the subtitle, is that a lot more full stacky lately. We'll get there, though. We'll get there. First, I want to talk about what it is at all. I don't think anybody's in here is particularly confused about what front-end development is, but it's worth putting a point on because I feel like this is the part that hasn't changed that much. For one, and this one is important to me because it's so personal, is that it's like a job that you're hired to do and are paid to do for money. I know that because I have a job board and people pay me to put front-end development jobs on there, and I put the smashing job board there too. People use that word. They're hiring for front-end developer, and then you're hired and it's on your business card. And I think there's something notable about that it's not this abstract concept that it's a thing that you get paid to do. And the job is, when you're hired to do that job, generally, as different as they all can be, is that it deals with literally with browsers, the people that use those browsers, and all the devices that those things are on. So it's it ends up being the job. Mina Markham put it well, I thought. There's audio in this. Audio.
Client. And in my mind, anyone...
Let's do it again.
It deals with things that you can see, things that are actually in front of you on the screen in a web client and a client. And in my mind, anyone who works on a user-facing interface or application, website, whatever, in my mind, that's a front-end developer.
Yeah, I just like the way she put it. It's like the browser, that thing that you see and interact with, or whatever assistive technology you're using to use it, that's your job. You got dev tools open. We're browser people, us front-end people. And the job is, so you care about the users, you're thinking about how they're using your product and what they're clicking on and scrolling and doing and all that. And so you have the browser open all day, but it's not like back-end people don't have their browser open all day too. It's not like back-end people don't care about the users. They clearly do too, but Monica makes a nice distinction, I think.
I struggle to phrase it in a way that's doesn't sound a back-end person doesn't care about the user or doesn't care about websites, because they kind of do too, right?
But they're totally allowed not to, right? If you're the person who's writing the SQL code for the database, I think you're totally allowed not to care about the user. This is your personal choice, because at that point, you're delegating your responsibility. So what I'm trying to say is that I think it's totally fine to not want to call yourself a front-end developer too.
Yeah, it's I'm going to make this case that the front-end development world is getting bigger and bigger, but it's not that back-end developers are getting any less important. I find they're just as important or more as ever, but you're kind of you have a certain set of responsibilities, and you've kind of delegated a lot of that browser stuff and user stuff just to a different role, which is fine too. So yeah, you deal with the browser. There's lots of browsers, lots of devices. That's your deal. You're in dev tools all day. You're making it work, handling the clicks. It's like the cliche slide from the responsive web design days. Not that those are over or anything, but I feel like we're all well aware of this now. It's less confusing. But it's dealing with browsers. I don't know. It's complicated. It doesn't get enough credit, really. So anyway, it's a job. You get paid to do it. Deals with the browsers, the users that use those browsers, and the devices those browsers run on, which ultimately comes down to, get this, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, for sure. The native languages of the web, those run in the browser. That's your domain as a front-end developer. Not particularly controversial, I don't think. I don't know. That's it. Those are the languages that you need to know. Now, it gets a little funny here because I, personally know and have talked to tons of developers who really live in the domain of those first two. They're happy, healthily employed developers who just write a lot of HTML, CSS, work in design systems, maybe have design, whatever. What they know in this world to be a front-end developer is like, they don't write that much JavaScript, if any at all. But there are still browser people. There's still front-end developers for sure. And more, there's a lot of front-end developers that kind of like just do the last one or dabble a little bit in the other two. So it's not like they're equal. It's not like to be a front-end developer, you need like an equal smattering of the skills across those three. It's like, it's more complicated than that. Anyway, that's not necessarily what this talk was about, but earlier this year I wrote this article that was kind of about that, in that like there's heavily JavaScript focused front-end developers and not. And that's just one way to slice up the complication that's happening in front-end development, but it's kind of a big one. And so that's perhaps worth a read. It's my thoughts, but it's like a hell of a lot of other people's thoughts on what's happening there too. Like I said, there's a lot of ways to slice this up, but I thought Brad Frost did a good job of it with this quote.
I don't want to sort of configure Webpack or like gulp like workflows and stuff like that. And so I found that I'm sort of on the more design, the front of the front end, and then sort of having somebody else that's more on like the back of the front end as a nice sort of complementary role.
Yeah, there's no front and back end anymore. It's just front of the front and back of the front. But I feel like we kind of feel that, right? There's like people that prefer one way or the other. So it's not that, like, there's divide stuff happening, but it's not that front-end development isn't a useful term anymore. It's broad, but it's still meaningful. It still has that kind of core meaning, I think. And so this is what I actually find interesting, is that there's a lot of like tasks that it takes to build a website, and there's a lot of them that maybe were like back-end stuff before that have just kind of moved over. They've just slowly have just become the domain of front-end developers. Not for every website in the world, but for a lot of them, that this is kind of happening underneath our feet, and it's observable in a way. And one of them that I think is a big deal that probably isn't somehow weirdly to me not talked about that much, because it feels like the decision was just made and that was that. Is that we just build things in components now, and everybody's cool with that. Like, it seems to be like solidified as the way that websites are built, large and small. And it's like, there's all these JavaScript frameworks, and we're not going to avoid talking about those. I'm a fan, really, but like they all like to disagree with each other on all kinds of different stuff and the different merits of them. But they all agree, even the native web stuff, web components, agree that components is the way to build websites. Small to medium to big, piece them all together, think and work in components in a way that back-end stuff didn't seem to do for me. It's like there was examples of it, I feel like, but when I'm working on the Ruby on Rails sites I've worked on in the past and my WordPress sites and stuff, they just don't operate in that way, at least by default. And then JavaScript comes along and is like, no, front ends are built in components. So anyway, I'm going to talk about a website that's personal to me. I work on CodePen. Let's like look at that idea of components a little bit. Let's say you were going to design that card thing, right? We literally call it an item on CodePen. That's how great we are at naming things. What's like a example of a component here? Well, we'll get to that, but like that little heart thing down there, just even that little thing is a component. It's a little piece of SVG that sits on the page to make a heart icon. But we have our own name for it. We call it an SVG icon component. And we do that because it's just a nice little abstraction around putting a little piece of code on the page. It ultimately ends up as HTML on the page with SVG inside of it, but having this abstracted component gives us some nice developer ergonomics. We can pass in the name of what icon we want to display, and it will just display it, and all kinds of like SVG best practices just kind of get jammed into the component, and it does what it needs to do in a nice way. So that even that tiny little thing on the page is a component, and then what else is a component? That thing. A different component. We just invented it, of course. It ends up being HTML on the page like anything else, but this one has a little bit of different responsibilities. It has to lay itself out in that particular little tiny little way, and it has some data that it needs to be aware of and tested. And in this case, it has a click handler, so that like responsibility of what happens when it's clicked is part of that component too. So it's just a little bit bigger, it has a little bit more responsibility, and again, it just makes sense to us as the authors who are constructing this page to build it in this way, these little components moving outward and outward. That thing becomes a component because it's a bunch of those meta items together that have their own special layout and responsibilities. And then I said, the whole thing is a card, so it probably doesn't, it's not much of a stretch of the imagination to imagine that we have a header for these things and previews for these things, and all those things together are what become an item for us. And it's just a choice. That was just us, thinking as a front-end team and with our designer, like, let's name these things in this way. Let's split up the responsibility of these things that we're building. That feels very like what's happening in modern front-end development at the moment, and it makes sense to everybody. So that happens too. Now we have a whole grid of things, and that makes sense because it has a different set of responsibilities. It lays itself out with certain styling, and in the case of a grid, it's paginated, so it deals with the pagination responsibilities and stuff like that. So components, they're great. Front-end developers like them. That ship has sailed. We build things in components now. That's our job. Designers like them because they're like, cool, we already work like that, so ship it, I guess. Cool. Like, let's be friends even more than we were. And other developers are like, yeah, components, got it. Sounds smart. Proceed, Kind of cool. Did you miss that one? Here, I'll get you. You good? Okay. Another one is site-level architecture. This feels like a newish thing to me in the past, which was, I need a new page. Ask a backend developer, hi, can I have this URL, please? And once it exists, then I'll build the thing that we need to build for this project at this URL that you gave to me on a little platter from backend land. Less so now, Now, imagine though, we left off at this item grid, fine, but what else is a component on this page? Sure, there's a title component, there's some, some menus, some buttons, a tabs component, sure. How about the sidebar? Yeah, okay, the whole thing's, I get it, the whole page is components. Cool. What's happened then is that the whole page becomes a component, and when that's the case, really what you've done is made the URL a component. So at some point in this land, it's not like every website in the world has to be built this way, but more and more they are. The components start as small as that tiny little icon and eventually become the entire site in itself, and that means that you do it all. If you need a new URL, you don't have to ask for a new URL anymore. The routing has just become your responsibility as the front-end development team. That site architecture, that's a kind of a big responsibility. I feel like that's something that wasn't necessarily always a front-end responsibility. It's now become like, okay, yeah, you do it. The URLs is your job now. Fine, we're the site architects now. That's cool. It's just new. It's just a new job to put on the pile of all the other crap that we already had to do. Fine. And then there's this whole idea of getting the data that's needed to render the page at all, which I feel like was firmly back-end territory. If the routing stuff wasn't, the data was. At least to me, it was like, I'll get the page all together, I'll mock it up, I'll do that, but somebody else is going to fill that thing with the data that it needs. And even that's changing to some degree, particularly with stuff like GraphQL. So let's just look at that. We'll just jump right to that because I think that's interesting. So we have this grid of stuff that we need to render on the page. We need to ask for data, which is, querying for data. Like a database query needs to be made in order to get the data to render those things. And on CodePen, we've moved to GraphQL, and it's so nice and empowering for this reason that, I know what I need as a designer who's building the components that is gonna build this page. So I kind of ask for it with this really nice syntax that just says, I need a collection of pens. I need a little bit of information about the collection, but for each one of those pens, I need a title, I need a description, I need some URLs, I need who owns it, I need to know how many comments it has and stuff like that. That information, it almost feels like somebody's just whiteboarding some data. They're like, what do we need? I need a title, a description, and then you're like, no, that's actual code, just ship it. Your whiteboard code just becomes a literal query that you use, which is nice. So there's like that heart button too. What's interesting is that now that's in my territory. Somehow getting all that data to render that page became my job somehow overnight. Fine, I can deal with it as long as it's nice syntax like that. And I mentioned that thing has like a click responsibility too, which I feel like was always like, I don't know, the clicking of it is front-end territory, but then what happens to that data and it going back to the server, that was always kind of like a back-end job to me. And it feels like that's less and less the case too. And that's called mutating data. So in case of CodePen, there's a number of hearts. You click it again, the number of hearts gets incremented by 1, and then that data needs to go back to the server for it to be told that. So a mutation is really super, in GraphQL land anyway, is really super similar to a query. It's structured in the same way. And so you end up wrapping the thing in this mutation component. And when you click it, some data changes and it executes this mutation that looks a lot like GraphQL, right? It has the same structure as the data that we just asked for. It just goes back to the server. I'm like, okay, that's my job too now? Mother, everything is becoming my job. Holy crap. So here's that card component. What I think is interesting about this component-driven development too is that we're starting to be like, let's just put it all together then. Like if there's going to be a file that's responsible for this component, all the different frameworks do it in different ways, but they all kind of agree that like it's probably like component.js that's going to do that thing. And then like, I don't know, those things can get pretty big, so maybe we'll just, for the ergonomics of it all, kind of split it up into files. So this is what our code base is starting to look like, which is like if it's a really simple component, it's just like component.js. And then this gets a little bit more complicated. We'll have like a folder and then an index.js. And the index.js is just boilerplate stuff. Like it's going to execute that query and it's going to do logging or whatever it needs to do. And then there's like a named component like home.jobs.js, which is just the template, just the view, just like the HTML of that component, as simple as it can be. And then like the queries is that big chunk of code. So why put that in the same file? We'll put that in a separate file that's like this component needs this data, so we're going to put that in this file that's sitting right next to the component itself. So everything is like just right next to each other. It just feels good. And then you'll notice there's some styling sitting right next to it too, and that kind of feels good. It feels like a light step into how you might approach styling at a component level. In this case, we're using technology called CSS modules that the component grabs, and it's not that we don't have global styles, it's just like there's some styles that are really specific to this component, and so we put those styles right next to that component, and ergonomically it feels just as smart as putting the queries right next to that component. It's like all stuff that matters just to this little chunk that's going to live on the page, and it gets applied to it, which is it's just good. It just feels like a nice way to work, you know? And Vue is similar in how it has like single file components that put all the stuff that are related to the component together. These things are just shaking out in our industry into best practices that are kind of cool. So there's an example of the modules too. I think it's kind of a nice way to work. It's like not necessarily all in on CSS and JS stuff, but it's just like a regular CSS file. In this case, we have all the conveniences of Sass too, which is great for us because it means we can continue to use our variables and media query breakpoints and stuff that are centrally located. But notice the selector is just called root. You don't even have to worry about naming because in CSS modules that class name gets rewritten into something kind of obscure and applied to the page in a way that is scoped just to that component, which also feels good. It gives some like confidence to the people that are writing this CSS and that they're not going to like break anything. It allows somebody to hop into the code base, make some styling adjustments, and not worry that they're going to burn the house down while they're doing it. I think that's kind of nice. So there's all this stuff that we just talked about, component-driven design and architecture and routing and getting data from the back end to the front end and dealing with APIs and talking about it and all that state management crap. That's just kind of become all of a sudden on the shoulders of front-end developers. That feels like more than a job all by itself, but it's not. That's just the new stuff. If you're a front-end developer, you still have to like be able to pull off the design you were handed at all. Like that's kind of fundamental. Like it's just assumed that you can do that. And you probably should be thinking systemically in some kind of way about what's reusable and what's not, if not having a full-blown design system these days. And you're worrying about accessibility and you're worried about performance because these things are like, they happen in the browser. They're your job as a front-end developer because you're a browser person and that's the deal. And you're testing across devices, and you're caring about the UX, and all that's already your job, but you're just handed a whole nother bucket of crap about. Anyway, it's a lot. And it's not that every single person in this room who's a front-end developer needs to know every single thing on every one of these lists and be amazing at all of it. It gets chopped up, you know, you specialize in stuff. It's just gonna happen anyway. But it's still in the front-end bucket, which is weird. Jobs. The stack gets bigger and bigger and bigger. It gets harder and harder to talk about.
I think like front-end developer is such a broad term it's hard to really define like what exactly a front-end developer is because there's so many different specialties, right? Like you can be a specialist in SVG animations and be a front-end developer and not write any JavaScript at all. Or you could be more working on the data layer like I am and not writing any CSS, for example, and still be considered a front-end developer. So I think it's kind of, as long as you're touching UI or touching something like a data layer that's tangentially related to UI, I think, you can identify as a front-end developer.
Yeah, right on. It's just weird. Bunch of stuff moved. Let's think about it a little bit abstractly from like on a back end to front end kind of spectrum. So like way back-endy is like, what operating system does my servers run on? I don't think I've ever been able to answer that question ever. And like, I'm so far away from that world. That's as back-endy as it gets, all the way to like core front-end technologies way on the other side. So if we're thinking about like stacks that websites are built on, here's a huge stack that's been huge forever and it's still huge now. The old LAMP stack, Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. If we're painting that on the spectrum, what we're talking about is almost all back-end stuff. Those acronyms they're just back-end things. So as a front-end developer, I've always been over here. There's me. I don't overlap with that stack at all. I have nothing to do with it. But what's interesting is over time that thing changes a little bit. Like, the mean stack comes along, the heyday of Angular, Mongo, Express, Node. Notice we've moved to the right. The operating system nobody cares about anymore. Like whatever, it's Linux probably, and then it's stretched, like we're talking about the framework in the stack. So it's stretching to the right as well. And as a front-end developer, I overlap with that because I work with the framework, of course, too. That's my job, and the APIs that power that framework. There's starting to be more overlap in the way that we talk about the stack that builds websites. And stacks, this is all just an example, but it's, they move around. And the serverless is super big lately, and rightfully so. It's super cool. Now we've moved way even more to the right. We're not even thinking about the servers that power things at all. We're just talking about writing server-side language and exposing some APIs. And as a front-end developer, I'm all up in that. I might even write those serverless functions myself. It's a pretty strong overlap between what's going on with building websites and front-end development as my skills stretch out too, Sean Wang wrote this article for CSS Tricks that he called a star stack, which is just more and more popular these days. It's a React site, but TypeScript and Apollo and GraphQL, and they're based on design systems. Everybody's got a design system these days. So star stack, and that's like, that's me. That's all. Now the stack that we're talking about that builds website is entirely front end. Just the way that we talk about it. It's just when we talk about stack, we're talking about what front end stack. Fascinating. Let's talk about serverless real quick. I have this site called The Power of Serverless. It's just at serverless.css-tricks.com that talks about the concept of this that I find fascinating. And I'm not a super expert in it. I just think it's interesting. So we have this site about upcoming front-end design conferences that's at the site, and it's just a static site. And I thought, you know what we'll do with this? We'll just have every conference just be a little piece of markdown data. And we'll run a static site generator, and it will turn that markdown data into whatever we want to do on the front end. It's a really popular way to build websites these days. Jamstack, it's great. And so the project folder itself is just a whole bunch of markdown files sitting in a folder. Fine, great. We'll use a static site generator like Eleventy to build it. Wonderful. What's I think is notable about this is now 100% of the data that's required to spin up this site is sitting there in a repo. And that's a big deal to me because it's not in a database, which you can't really put in something like GitHub. So it allows me to take pull requests for the content of the site, which I think is notable, and there's not a great story for that outside of a situation like this. And it's been a big deal. Like the whole site now is powered by pull requests of people just running conferences, doing pull requests on the thing. It's a nice system. You'll throw it up on Netlify. That's just nice because it's just convenient for lots of reasons. But here's a really particularly notable reason why it's cool, or two reasons. One of them is, markdown files, isn't that nerdy? You're the only person that contributed. Now, like sometimes we don't pick a static site generator because we need a CMS to hand to a client. Well, Netlify has this CMS where you just you just magically configure it with like one line of code, and then it becomes like a UI over those markdown files. So you go in there and edit stuff and hit save, and it makes a git commit and just commits it for you. It's like does all the git stuff behind the scenes. So it's like a GUI that you get, but it's still the same system. You know, like you can do either one. They work together kind of perfectly, which is cool. And here's a little feature of this site that can't be done on the front end. It just can't be done. I type in an email address and I hit send on the thing, and it's going to generate an email about this conference, and it's going to end up in my inbox. There is no browser API for sending an email. It's not a thing. You need some kind of service to do it. People use Amazon SES. So there's a million. It's like a commodity market of services that will send an email for you. But they have API keys. You know, like you can't expose that in front-end JavaScript. You need like a back-end. You need a little PHP script or something, or probably a Node script that was going to send that email for you. So here we'll just use Spark Post, just pick it out of a hat. There's a million services just like it. They have docs, they have a NPM library that's like, this is how you use our little service. Here's a handful of code. You just NPM install Spark Post and then call the send email function and pull your API keys and send the damn email. It couldn't be easier to write this, but that piece of code isn't browser JavaScript, it's Node JavaScript. It needs to run on a server to protect those API keys. Well, because it's on Netlify, I just throw it in a folder called functions and it works. It just will execute that on a serverless Node function. That's powerful developer ergonomics that you just kind of get for free there, which is just kind of amazing. And whole sites can be architected in that way now. That was a tiny example, but you can build your whole damn site that way if you want. So what's happened in a way is that I don't have to care about operating. I haven't ever cared about operating systems, but you know, if we're talking about what's happening to front-end development, let's wipe those away. I don't care about servers. We'll do serverless stuff for that. Wipe those things away. And even the database, databases are just as important now as they ever have been. But I'm striking it away because a lot of times what you're dealing with as a database is just like an API to get and change that data. It's like you're just dealing with an API. Like as a front-end developer, there's all kinds of choices for that in a way, and I just don't have to worry about like managing the database. It's probably managed for me in a way, or it's a headless CMS, or it's using some developer fancy thing like Firestore or Fauna. So cool, let's not worry about that. So this is my new spectrum of stuff that I care about as a front-end developer. I can deal with the server-side stuff, not my forte, but because I can write in Node and just throw it in a folder and have it executed like it's Node, I'm kind of writing server-side stuff myself, which is cool. It's in my wheelhouse anyway, because it's just JavaScript. And of course, APIs and frameworks, I'm a JavaScript-focused developer, so that's all in my wheelhouse. And of course, the fundamentals of front-end is locked in, that's me. So I kind of like got the whole spectrum now. And so all that stuff, which is, that's interesting, and that like, I know Git. I can design stuff poorly. I can write tests. I know about how to make a build process happen and how the deployment pipeline works and all this like other stuff that just goes in the basket of crap that you need to know to make a website. When you think about it, you got the whole spectrum covered and you got all these little tangential stuff covered. That's amazing. You're damn right I'm a full stack developer. Like that's interesting that front end has just become like, I can do it all. People like introduce themselves that way. Hey, Chris, full stack developer. Cool. Be proud. That's good. Big haystack, though. You know, it's a lot of crap to learn, which is fine, and you're probably not going to know it all. I sure as hell don't, but which just means that like some of that stuff you're going to be better at than other stuff, and that's fine. You can't even get away with it. It's the cliche. It's the horse. You know, like some people are just better at the back stuff. Which is fine, but it's funny is because it's making fun of people, which they deserve it. But what's notable is the horse is complete. You know, you might suck at some parts of it, but you still made the whole horse. This is actually a self-portrait of me. I'm more like killer on the front stuff, not so much on the back. But I can still write a crappy little Node function back there and make it happen. You know, at least I'm a complete dragon. Anyway, the horse and the dragon together. Ooh, I should mock that up. How much time do we have? Fire up some Photoshop here. Combine those things. I'm going to do that. That's a good idea. Now I'm sad that I don't have a horse dragon slide. Anyway, look at that. Like, that's so cool. I don't know. Anyway, thanks for listening. I was just trying to paint a picture of what's happening to front-end development and all the little slices of it, and as to set the stage today for Front Conference. So I'm so glad you're all here. It's cool to see this packed up room full of people that care about websites and stuff, and like, let's spend the rest of the day learning about website stuff.